Good afternoon and good morning to those joining us out west. I'm Karen Langdon with the National Emergency Management Association, and I'd like to welcome you to the NEMA Empowerment e-learning series. We're very excited to showcase the EMAC program today and focus on EMAC reimbursement advances, streamlining processes, and expediting support. It's my pleasure to introduce Angela Copple, the EMAC Program Director at NEMA. Take it away, Angela.
All right, thanks, Karen. Well, I'm Angela Copple, the EMAC Program Director at the National Emergency Management Association. In all of my 18 years with NEMA, this is the only second webinar we've ever done that is focused solely on reimbursement, and it is the first that's open up to all of NEMA's membership. With so many of you involved in reimbursement package processing, even in the private sector, we wanted to make sure that you were aware of updates within EMAC procedures. Anyone who knows me knows that I am very passionate about EMAC. Seeing the EMAC process work and helping states help one another just makes me happy. I'll be even happier once everyone understands the EMAC reimbursement procedures and guidelines and follows them. I am joined today with Joyce Flynn and Beth Zimmerman. Ladies, do you want to introduce yourselves?
Thanks, Angela. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Joyce Flynn, and I think something all the presenters have in common today is a passion for emergency management and EMAC. I worked for the state of Iowa Homeland Security and Emergency Management for 23 years, ending my career as the director. I became involved in EMAC in 1998 and have served as chair of the EMAC committee, chair of the EMAC Executive Task Force, lead of the EMAC National Coordinating State, EMAC Lead State Representative for FEMA Region 7, EMAC Authorized Representative, and EMAC Designated Contact. I've deployed numerous state and local resources through EMAC over the course of my career and have gone on several deployments myself. Now retired, I continue to support my passion for EMAC and emergency management as an advisor to NEMA. Thanks, Angela.
All right, Beth.
Hey, yes. Good afternoon. Good morning, everybody. I'm Beth Zimmerman. I've got over 35 years of emergency management experience. Started my career in Utah, moved to Arizona, and most recently it was at FEMA during the Obama administration, running response and recovery. So recovery has been my passion, and reimbursement has been my thorn in my side, but to make it happen, it's also very much so my passion to make sure states, locals always get back the money that they deserve from disasters. So I was very happy after my career ended at FEMA, the change of the administration back then. Angela and I have now been working for a couple of years, and Joyce and the EMAC team. I've been working with EMAC or seen EMAC work all my career. For as long as it's been there, working side by side with public assistance, which is where I started my career. So very excited for this, for some of the changes we've been able to work together within EMAC and within FEMA. And we're very happy to have all of you here so that we can help share the information so that we're all working off of the same set of rules. So I'll turn it back over to you, Angela. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Joyce and Beth. Today, we're going to talk about the basis of EMAC reimbursement, review the EMAC process and recommended timelines for reimbursement, identify tools available to help develop the reimbursement package, review areas of standardization to simplify reimbursement, review cost eligibility and source documentation requirements, and then finally, review changes in FEMA public assistance to streamline reimbursement through FEMA PA for EMAC. I'm going to start what's typically at the very end, right? The learn more. NEMA has a free online course that you can access on the EMAC website, emacweb.org. It is very aptly called EMAC Reimbursement. As you can guess from the title, it focuses just on reimbursement and will give you a lot more information than what you're here today. It walks you even through some scenarios and lets you choose the best outcomes. I highly recommend everyone who has a role in reimbursement to take this EMAC course. It will take you approximately an hour and a half to 2 hours to complete, and it will solidify your understanding of EMAC reimbursement. All right, commercial over. If you aren't familiar with EMAC, there are 5 phases of the EMAC process. While we're going to focus on reimbursement today, I want to stress that reimbursement is in every phase of the EMAC process. During pre-event preparation, jurisdictions should develop reimbursement policies, review enabling mechanisms, update plans and procedures, and identify who is responsible for the development and review of reimbursement packages as both a requesting and an assisting state. It is also incredibly important to be trained on how to develop a mission-ready package that has a good cost estimate, as that is the basis of the offer of assistance. In activation, states should review funding mechanisms in preparation for reimbursement. And during the request and offer process, the Resource Support Agreement, or RSA, should contain a good cost estimate based on a mission-ready package. During a response, changes to the mission should be captured and amendments should be completed if needed. And all of that is before we even get to reimbursement. There are 4 items that set the basis for EMAC reimbursement: the law, the Resource Support Agreement, jurisdictional policies, and the EMAC Operations Manual. We're going to look at a little bit more detail for all of these. Article 9 of EMAC law addresses reimbursement. In short, the law says you will be reimbursed for mission-related expenses, including damage to equipment. It also makes clear in Article 8 that you can't request reimbursement for workers' compensation claims. The second item that sets the basis for EMAC reimbursement is the Resource Support Agreement, or RSA. The RSA is the legally binding agreement between the 2 EMAC members that sets the terms and the conditions of that specific mission. There is 1 RSA completed for each EMAC mission. The RSA is a 2-part document. Section 1 is signed by the assisting state and contains the request and offer with all the cost estimates and the other terms and conditions for that offer. Section 2 is signed by the requesting state, and it accepts the terms, conditions, and cost estimates. The RSA is completed within the EMAC operations system, where states can go back and look at those at any time. They can also complete amendments to the RSA. Many finance people think that the RSA and reimbursement packages have to be an exact match. That is simply not the case. The RSA can be amended, but it is based on cost estimates, not actual costs. The law says that all mission-related costs must be paid, so even if a cost isn't on the RSA, but it is mission-related, eligible, reasonable, and documented, it must be paid. The third item that sets the basis for EMAC reimbursement is jurisdictional policies, and this is often overlooked and incredibly important. Every resource provider should have jurisdictional policies that sets the basis of costs for personnel, per diem rates, equipment, and more. The jurisdictional policies must be created prior to the event. They must be in compliance with state policies or federal policies, and they must be reasonable. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. The fourth item that sets the basis for EMAC reimbursement is the EMAC Operations Manual. All EMAC members have agreed to follow the guidelines in the EMAC Operations Manual. Over the past years, especially probably the last 2, we have made some big changes in the EMAC Operations Manual to make clear the intent of the law and to standardize the reimbursement process. The EMAC reimbursement process is straightforward. So deployed personnel complete their mission, they come back home, they turn in all their receipts, their equipment logs, their timesheets, and other documentation to their home state agency, the resource provider. The resource provider develops the EMAC R2 reimbursement package and compiles all supporting documentation for the claim, along with copies of jurisdictional policies. It goes without saying that the better the R2 reimbursement package, the faster the entire process for reimbursement. Submitting reimbursement packages with ineligible costs, no supporting cost documentation, or just incomplete packages delays not just that reimbursement package, but all reimbursement packages. In 2017, I did a study that looked at delays in the reimbursement process. And I discovered that 1 year after Hurricanes Maria, Harvey, and Irma, 73% of the reimbursement packages had not been submitted. I will be the first to admit that that was not what I expected to find. Most people just automatically throw the requesting state under the bus for being slow. And the issue was actually way before them. It was back here in the resource provider column. It clearly showed that this is where we need to focus a lot of time and attention in order to expedite reimbursement. The assisting state, once they receive the R2 packages, will compile the R1 package for each mission and then send that to the requesting state. The requesting state will audit and then pay the assisting state. Simple, right? Well, yes, in theory, it is quite simple. It's all the more reason why we've been working towards the standardization of eligibility, documentation requirements, processes, and more. I want to point out, but by the time the R2 package gets to that requesting state, it's gone through 2 reviews, the resource provider review and the assisting state review. The requesting state's actually conducting the 3rd review of that R2 package. To help develop the R2 package, we've put together a job aid that walks the resource provider how to compile it step by step. The membership also standardized the EMAC R2 summary form that must be filled out by the resource provider. It includes the summarization of all expenses for that mission. It must be certified and included in that R2 reimbursement package. We've also developed a job aid for how to fill out that R2 summary form. Now let's look at some of the policy updates made to standardize reimbursement. The requesting state must identify any source documentation requirements that are above and beyond what's in the EMAC operations manual during the request and offer phase. If a requesting state does not include these items in the request, they cannot deny a claim during reimbursement that does not have this documentation. Also, there is no requirement in EMAC procedures for personnel activity logs to be submitted. The R2 summary form serves as the daily log for personnel alongside the source documentation provided, such as the timesheets. Next is a statement on the validation of policy documents. Full policy documents are not required. Only the relevant sections of the policy, along with the name of the resource provider and the date the policy was adopted, must be identified. There's also a statement that says if a resource provider does not have policies and does not use state or federal policies, the basis of cost can be proven by non-EMAC cost documentation paid prior to the EMAC deployment. A statement on what is reasonable is also included in the latest version of the EMAC operations manual, which can be used by states to validate jurisdictional policies if needed. EMAC guidelines do recommend 45 days between each phase of the reimbursement process, but also says if a timeline is not met, the requesting state is still on the hook to pay the assisting state. Proof of payment has been, I'd say, a sticking point for years. Many states have policies or laws where they're not allowed to pay resource providers until they have been paid themselves by the requesting state. So we made that very clear in the EMAC operations manual that the assisting state does not have to show proof of payment, but the resource provider does. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Joyce to review cost eligibility and source documentation requirements. Joyce, take it away.
Thanks, Angela. So I am going to go through what are eligible costs and then the documentation for those costs. And one thing I'd like to highlight is, as you'll notice up there under where it says eligible costs, throughout this presentation, we've tried to reference the places in the EMAC operations manual where there is additional information. So if that's something that pops up at some point, you know where to go find it in that EMAC operations manual. So as you will see here, personnel, regular time, overtime, holiday pay, all of these things are included as eligible costs. However, I do want to stress that, as Angela has mentioned, the labor policies, if you were not overtime eligible before an EMAC deployment, you can't suddenly become overtime eligible for an EMAC deployment. So again, those labor policies are the guiding mechanism for requesting reimbursement. So some of the proof you need for that, as you'll see there are several ways, but most people now, or most entities now, have some kind of a financial system that manages their payroll. So we want to make sure that that is highlighted as the easiest way, much easier than people having to go and submit a bunch of pay stubs for the time that they deployed. Air travel. When you are talking about traveling, and most people, when they're deploying for EMAC, unless you're a team that's taking a lot of equipment with you, most people are going to fly. It does cover the cost of an economy class airfare unless there are extenuating circumstances. And as you'll note, again, the page reference there, baggage fees and change fees. One of the extenuating circumstances, just to mention, is if time is of the essence, there are no economy class fares, you would then need to double check to make sure if a business class seat was available, whether or not that could be reimbursed. As you'll see there, all of us travel a lot, I'm sure, so we get receipts for all of that stuff. Whether we book through a travel agent, whether we do it online, you get a receipt. So receipt for your airline ticket, your baggage fees, your change fees are all required for reimbursement of your air travel. And then for reimbursement, as Angela mentioned, that resource provider does have to show that they paid the deployed personnel unless they purchased the deployed person's ticket. For meals, there are two ways that this is often captured. It may be by per diem, which is an easy way, but it may also be that there's a requirement for these personnel to provide receipts. So each day, breakfast, lunch, dinner, incidentals at the rate established by the travel policy is how you would do per diem. The other thing is receipts. So you would need to capture a receipt from every meal you ate out from the restaurant. And the other thing I want to mention here is there may be meals that are provided. As I mentioned, I'm from Iowa, and when we had EMAC people responding to our State Emergency Operations Center, we cater food when we're activated there. So if meals are provided, you can't then turn around and claim an expense for a meal that was provided. Documentation. You would have to provide a proof of your travel policy, which identifies the per diem rate. And then when you get to your receipts, it's the actual cost of the meal. Again, your travel policy, proof of payment. Alcohol is not reimbursable. And just a tip here, a lot of EMAC deployments are 14 days plus travel days. So as you can imagine, if you're keeping receipts, that's a lot of little pieces of paper to keep track of over the course of 2 weeks. So you may want to make sure you send your folks with a large envelope or some kind of a mechanism for them maintaining those receipts to ensure reimbursement. For lodging, any costs associated with staying at a hotel, an Airbnb, VRBO, campground, whatever. There are some states that may direct bill hotels. And again, from an Iowa example, Camp Dodge was right across the street from our State Emergency Operations Center. So there was a time or two that we just put people up at Camp Dodge, and then there were no lodging expenses for those individuals to claim. I'm so sorry, somebody's ringing my doorbell. So for lodging, you would need a receipt of the paid invoice and the guests who stayed, the time frame, and all those things. And if multiple people are staying in the same room as you note there, you've got to document that. And a special note is that, I'm so sorry, a credit card statement is not proof of documentation for a lodging stay. Ground transportation, it may be a taxi, a shuttle, whatever, ride share, or you may be authorized to rent a vehicle and the fuel for that. Again, receipts are required with the origin, destination points, the amount paid. And for a rental vehicle, a copy of the rental agreement with the name of the renter and the dates and a receipt or paid invoice. And of note here, I'd like to stress, just for ease of bookkeeping, if I, for example, rent a car on a deployment, I wouldn't then ask Beth to pay for all the gas, because then it'd be hard for Beth to claim costs for a vehicle when she didn't rent a vehicle. Ground transportation as well may be driving your own car or a government-owned vehicle. And again, that you would need to track those departure points, daily work activities, those kinds of things while you're deployed. Fuel receipts for your personal vehicle or a government vehicle. And again, credit card statements are not acceptable documentation. Again, we're looking for a policy to authorize the mileage rate. And then it is important, if you're driving, to note the odometer readings. If I go back and forth to my work site every day and it's 10 miles, you can do that every day, provide documentation of 1 day. And again, then you need to know that the resource provider has paid those deployed personnel for the costs that they incurred for transportation. Parking and tolls, again, eligible, and we run into this a lot on the East Coast when there are deployments that direction, but those fees, highway, bridge tolls are eligible for reimbursement. And just like we've talked about throughout, parking and tolls, again, you need the receipts, the location, the amount paid, and then documentation that the resource provider did pay the deployed personnel. And because, again, of our technology world, it may be that if you had a personal owned vehicle, and some of these anymore, instead of stopping at the old toll booths like we used to have to, it gets your license plate number. So some of these may come after the fact, but again, just documentation of whatever tolls you may incur and getting the receipts to get those reimbursed. And I will turn it over to Beth, and she's going to cover the next section of costs. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Joyce. And thanks everybody that's on here for the webinar. So yes, so more into eligibility. This is always a big thing, and like has been emphasized by both Angela and Joyce. We need to make sure that whatever we're asking for is eligible and it's documented. So getting into the equipment. So the actual cost of any fuel maintenance, those things that you incur during the mission as if you're taking your own equipment, if you're renting equipment, we're going to cover all of that. We need to take a look at what rates are being used. So making sure if you are taking equipment, you need to document when you're taking it, when you're using it, what type of equipment it is, what, sizes, all of that type of description for that, as well as those logs should also be showing who is operating that equipment, so that who's going to be accountable for it when it's out there in the field, who's going to be operating it. So the dates that it's being used, the hours that it's being used, and all of this, if you do have certain pieces of equipment that you're trying to use and you might not use it the full duration of the deployment, you need to document anything that's special. If you are looking for the equipment to be reimbursed for the whole time it's gone, how is that documented within your own policies, and what is it you're asking for? And those types of things should be in the RSA and be agreed to prior to leaving, so that you don't have issues afterwards. We do see that come up in a number of cases where what the resource provider is asking for once they get back home. So just make sure the documentation is there, as well as what equipment rate they're using. So a lot of jurisdictions do have their own equipment rates. If they're a local jurisdiction, they might have one. If they don't, they may use their state's equipment rates. Or if they don't have that either, they may use the FEMA equipment rates. And those FEMA equipment rates can be found on FEMA.gov. Next slide. And the equipment rates must be reasonable. We have seen a few resource providers basically put in for the cost of a brand new vehicle and just kind of divided it up by the number of days deployment. So it must be reasonable. And the best way to know if something is reasonable is to look at the GSA rates or the FEMA rates to make sure that they are in line with that. But as long as there is the reasonable test and if you're not people aren't trying to make a profit off of this. We just want to make sure that the resource providers know and understand the different levels of equipment rates that they can pick from. But if they have them, they should use their own. Next slide. Equipment repair. We know that a lot of the EMAC missions, you go out, the status on the ground might be, you're going into a disaster situation, a really bad one, typically, if EMAC is being deployed to get out there. So any type of equipment repairs, obviously, you're not going to know about that. But this is something that is eligible. And you can see there the EMAC operations manual, the pages 68, 69 cover what you should be doing. So if you are out there on a deployment and you need to, something breaks on the piece of equipment, if you're able to repair it in the field, this should all be discussed. Correspondence should be in writing if possible, but have that discussion and have it signed off also by your person that you're working with. So as the documentation, you would be looking for is photographs of the damaged, whether it's a vehicle, a piece of equipment, explain what happened to the equipment. And also remember that if, just like any other case, if there is insurance available on that piece of equipment, you should be going to your insurance company. You might have a deductible that you need to pay. If it's not something that's insured, make sure that any receipts that you have for the repair of the vehicle or the piece of equipment, if it's going to be left there where you deployed to, or if it's going to go back home, all of those things should be written up, documented, so everybody knows. Also, maintenance records. If you show up to a disaster scene and you have mobilized your pieces of equipment and you show up and they're broken, or not in good repair, you need to be able to document that it was in good repair when you left home, when you left their home jurisdiction, and to make sure that it was in working operational situation before the deployment. Also looking at depreciation for equipment. So if something is, say it's 10 years old, it breaks out on the scene and you need to get a new one, we'd be looking at what the insurance covers for it, as well as if you, like I said, had a 10-year-old piece of equipment, you're not necessarily going to get a brand new one, but what would be the value of that you would be charging the requesting state. Next slide. Equipment replacement, I kind of covered that, but the cost to anything that is destroyed, looking at what the cost of the new piece of equipment was, looking at what insurance was covered, what is the current value of that piece of equipment that you had out in the field when you were deployed, and to make sure that you're compensated fairly when it gets back, and to be able to recover that and to be able to get a new piece of equipment. Once again, looking at if equipment needs to be replaced, you're looking at different, the things that you would look for in your packet when you submit for reimbursement. Photographs documenting the equipment, what was the insurance claim, if you weren't able to, if it was denied, if it was approved, explanation of how that piece of equipment was damaged or destroyed, I should say, in the field. And once again, it's the maintenance records and looking at depreciation. So it's the things that you would typically need to submit if you were doing an insurance claim. So a lot of times your insurance claim will cover most of what is also required for EMAC. But once again, I would stress anything that is damaged, destroyed while out on a deployment, make sure you have the requesting state, somebody from the requesting state. You might be in a local jurisdiction, whoever you're working for and reporting to, make sure that that stuff is signed off. So somebody is there as a witness as far as what happened in the field. Next slide. Commodities. When you go out into the field, sometimes you need to buy some supplies, whether it's office supplies, it could be some provisions that you found you needed that you weren't anticipating when you left on the mission. So all those types of commodities, they can be eligible for EMAC reimbursement also. So you just need to, once again, make sure that you've documented what it is you bought, why you bought it. If somebody there from the requesting state, one of the jurisdictions within the requesting state, asked you to go out and purchase it, get something in writing if you can, because that's always best to have the requirement and to be able to show then the receipts, the paid invoice. It should be a detailed invoice as much as possible, whatever you're going to be purchasing, to make sure that you're not being price gouged and it is a fair market value for what you were buying, whatever was necessary at that point in time. And an invoice for these items should be, if the commodities were taken from the resource provider's own inventory. So if before the resource providers deployed to the requesting state, if the requesting state asked them to bring in something because it was in short supply where they were going. And so if the resource providers needed to bring that, they should be noting whether or not they pulled it from their own inventory, or if it's something they went out and purchased. And so making sure that they have the fair market value. And if they do pull it from their own inventory, they can submit an invoice showing what they needed to pay for it once they got back home, or if somebody back home was buying it. So just, it's a matter of what commodity was used, what did it cost to replace it, or to purchase it. Next slide. Other things, if I can, can you back up one? Sorry. One of the things, if you do go out, you bring commodities with you from a resource provider, and then you don't end up using all of them, if you leave them there with the requesting state, you can claim those as inventory that is gone from your supply. But if you do, as a resource providers, take that inventory back, that should also be documented, the number of units of that inventory that you took back, so that you're not charging the requesting state for something that you took back home. Thank you. Other things that you might incur eligible, that are also eligible, potentially eligible expenses. Some things, service charges that are billed. Just make sure that you have the rates, the receipts for it. What are those things? Other things that you just never know. We all know when we travel, we never know what we're going to have to buy, and especially when folks are going out to a disaster site. You don't know what the situation, always know exactly what the situation is and some of the things that you might need to purchase. So on there, it says, zero balance receipts. So obviously, if you're going out, if you have to go to an Office Depot for office supplies, or wherever you might be going to medical supplies, just make sure it shows a paid receipt that you have purchased. Make sure you're able to document that. And these are some of the examples that you never know what you might need to get. A lot of times people have satellite phones, but they don't get charged for them until they use them. So if you're going to be using that, as you say, some of the PPE that's required, if you're going to, depending on where you're going to go, any of the bottled water, batteries, these types of things. And once if you're getting in a situation where you're finding you're going to buy a lot of this, just make sure you're in communications with the folks that you're assisting, so that they know you are purchasing these items. And it should not be a surprise once the receipts come back in and the request, the reimbursement request that comes forward. Next slide. Negotiated cost. As Angela mentioned, there are some costs that might not be listed in the EMAC operations manual, but something that either the requesting state is asking the assisting states to bring, or if there's something that the assisting states feel that they need to have. And so make those things very clear. Like we say, if it's in the EMAC operations manual, it's pretty much good to go. But if it's not, if it's something else that you need to have, there might be some, a lot of times there's some very unique situations and people really need to figure out what else they might need to bring. Make sure those things are put into the RSA and agreed upon prior to deployment, and to make sure that there's no hidden costs, nothing that pops up that's going to be an issue between the requesting state and the assisting state. So all of these should be agreed upon in advance. And also I'll make one little note. We're going to get into some of the FEMA stuff in a minute, but if it's something that's not eligible for FEMA reimbursement, a lot of disasters, a lot of missions, the requesting state is able to get reimbursement from FEMA. So FEMA will pay for the things that are that they have for eligibility. So if there's something that would fall out of FEMA's eligibility, the requesting state is still required to pay the assisting state if it is in the RSA and if it was agreed upon and signed. So those are things that you need to look for. The example that's listed on this slide here is backfill. So if when the individuals leave, when the resource providers get deployed, if there is a cost for backfill, you want to make sure that that is in the RSA and is negotiated for the rates, because each we're finding that, pretty much it's different in all the states how the backfill is handled. And so that also needs to be backed up by a policy as to why they're claiming it. But if it's something that you're going to be going out, you want to make sure that is covered in the RSA pre-going out to deployment. Next slide. Ineligible costs. So these are things, pre and post deployment costs. So as you're getting ready, but once you take off, your costs are covered, but anything that you're doing pre or post are not covered if they're not included in the RSA. Consider that one of the negotiated costs. Any extraordinary costs, obviously, as we were discussing with the equipment. So anything that just seems a little bit, is too high, you want to make sure your reasonable costs. If you purchase equipment, we've had this happen also before. People go out and purchase equipment because they need to beforehand, or while they're out in the field. You need to look and see if you're buying equipment as a resource provider in the field. You want to make sure that that equipment, if it's being turned over, if the requesting state is keeping it, it's theirs. You can't put in for a reimbursement on something that stayed there. And looking at the deploying personnel, if they need to make any purchases, we just need to make sure that everything is documented as to why they're purchasing it. Damages associated with personal properties. So clothing, your own personal electronic devices are not typically eligible costs. And any costs that don't adhere to the written policies. So you really want to make sure the resource providers should be looking now, if it's somebody that goes out quite often, to make sure that what they want to claim for eligible cost is in written policy as to what they are being paid for. And obviously, one of the biggies for EMAC, costs incurred where assets are self-deployed. The whole purpose of EMAC is to not have people self-deploying, but to have it be an organized and follow the process and procedures of EMAC as they go forward. So we wouldn't be covering any costs for self-deployed. Next slide, please. So now I want to get into the FEMA Public Assistance Memorandum, Simplifying PA Program Part 2. So what does all that mumbo jumbo mean? So Angela and I worked with FEMA back in the back end of 2021 to figure out how we could make sure that EMAC and FEMA, when there is FEMA reimbursement under the Public Assistance Program, could work as quickly as possible. Because everybody knows that we're looking for getting the resource providers reimbursed as quickly as possible so that they're able to reset and to be able to go out and respond to the next EMAC mission when it comes. As well as for them, as well as to keep the good working relationship between the states, so that the states are paying each other during their times of disaster. So Angela and I were working with FEMA, and back on September 6th of 2022, a date that's forever in our minds, we were able to, and also as a side note for everyone that knows, I worked at FEMA. I've never seen a policy get done in less than 10 months, and Angela and I, worked through it. We got it, and working with the great folks within FEMA Public Assistance at headquarters and the regions. So to be able to simplify it. So the way going forward, I'm not going to talk about what was, but what is now is that FEMA accepts the EMAC process as it is going forward. So ever since the policy was signed on September 6th, so Hurricane Ian was pretty much the first disaster after the policy was adopted. So EMAC is, or I should say FEMA. So when there is a federally declared disaster and EMAC is been used and deployed, then FEMA will come in and just look at the RSA. I think the next slide details it. So FEMA just looks, all FEMA wants is, and is requiring, is the R1. So that form that goes from the assisting state to the, let me back up, sorry, the RSA. So the resource support agreement is all FEMA requires in order to start that initial obligation. So when FEMA has approved for their public assistance program, for that state, then they put together public assistance packages called project worksheets. So there will be one project worksheet for the state, for the requesting state, to be able to fill out. So any and all of their resource support, their RSAs, will get into one project worksheet. They will take those totals that are on that, those estimates, as Angela talked about. So whatever, if that estimate is $100,000, FEMA will, based on the RSA, put together a package and will obligate that $100,000 for this requesting state. And then as the assisting states submit the R1s with all the associated R2 forms and proof of payment, and so what then the payments can go to the assisting states to pay, from the requesting state. So FEMA is not going to go back and look at every single piece of documentation. FEMA has determined that it is in their best interest, and EMAC is a low risk, as it states helping states, and how FEMA wants to have more states use EMAC. It is the best resource out there, the easiest resource to be able to share. And so trying to get them paid, as I said, once again. And so FEMA then will make those payments, the money will be sitting there for the requesting state, and then the assisting states can get paid as quickly as possible. And I'll just do a commercial here. I know that Alex from Florida, I saw him on this earlier. We're working with them as one of the big clients under Ian, and it has worked a lot faster for them. In between the state of Florida and between FEMA Region 4. So this process is no longer looking, bottom line is no longer double looking, triple looking at all the documentation. As Angela stated, it's already gone through so many audits when this paperwork comes forward. So next slide. Okay, so I'm going to turn it back over to Angela. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Joyce and Beth. We've reached our next area of questions. So if you haven't put a question in that you have, go ahead and put it in the chat and we'll go ahead and start knocking through those.
Angela, the first question, is there a hard timeline of when a requesting state needs to be reimbursed if it goes beyond 45 days?
There is not a hard timeline. Is obviously suggested 45 days, but there's not a hard timeline. We do recommend that everyone maintain open communications. Typically, if it goes beyond 45 days, it's because there is a documentation requirement issue, and that needs to be resolved, usually back down to the resource provider level. So once that is identified, it needs to be quickly communicated back down to the resource provider through the assisting state, so that source documentation can be provided and that can be resolved.
Thank you. Next question. What is the effective date for this guidance? For example, no activity logs or timesheets.
So no activity logs was put into the EMAC operations manual in December of 22. Timesheets are required as part of the documentation, the source documentation for personnel.
For meal costs, how do you distinguish actual meal costs with receipts paid with responding entity issued credit cards versus employees' personal credit cards?
This is Joyce. I'll jump in on that one. Mary, if I'm understanding you correctly, some of the costs were paid on one credit card, some on another. If you have meal receipts, most restaurants put the last four of the credit card number at the bottom of the receipt. So you would need to then sort through those, determine what was paid by the employee's personal credit card and what went on a responding entity's credit card to make sure the appropriate person gets reimbursed. But you should, and I just did this recently, looking at credit cards receipts from restaurants, making sure that number is on there. And what we were stressing is that a credit card statement is not proof of supporting documentation.
Thank you, Joyce. What documentation should a responding entity provide a requesting entity to support the fringe benefit costs claimed as part of the labor costs? The pay stubs we provide to a requesting state was not sufficient.
I think if I'm
About it.
understanding that, so the R2 form has the breakdown of the benefits, which should, of course, be validated through the jurisdictional policy, and then, of course, validated against what was supplied under the timekeeping system for that resource provider.
Okay, next one. This is a couple of years ago. We had a requesting state that was asking for proof of ownership for our deployed equipment, which we had a hard time documenting since it was a National Guard asset.
That's a great question. And that was actually one of the big things that we were able to use when we were talking with FEMA about, updating some of the reimbursement requirements under FEMA, because you don't have proof of ownership for National Guard assets. And quite frankly, it's rather silly to have to show proof of ownership for any equipment deployed on EMAC mission. If you have to rent something, you're going to have a contract that shows you're renting it. So why do you have to show proof of ownership for a piece of your normal equipment that you have, out in your normal routine work? So we actually removed that completely. It was not within the EMAC guidelines, but it was in FEMA's guidelines. And after we explained it to FEMA, they were like, well, that makes a lot of sense. So that was one of the things that they said, okay, we're going to adopt the EMAC guidelines when reviewing EMAC missions, because that makes total sense.
Okay, next question. For equipment, you indicated fuel costs were eligible for reimbursement. Would this be in addition to the FEMA equipment hourly rate?
I think this one's you, Beth.
Thanks. Yeah, so fuel costs are eligible unless they are part of the calculation for the rented equipment or your equipment rate. So if it's already part of the equipment rate, no. If your equipment rate is not part of the hourly rate, then you could be claiming fuel costs.
Thanks, Beth. Next question. Can we use the new workbook for legacy packages to help remedy some of the confusion, or do they need to be done in the workbook that was used during that disaster?
That's a really good question. I would say fill out the R2 summary form and go ahead and give that to them and see if they will accept it. Obviously, it's a little bit difficult because the new policy wasn't adopted, the operations manual, in December of 22, and then we made another big change in, I think it was May of 2023. So those changes are not retroactive back to when that disaster occurred, but I think the new forms are really helpful to help clarify some of those questions and issues. So it might be beneficial to complete the new R2 form and submit it to help clarify some of the questions that they have.
Thanks, Angela. Last question for now, but please continue to post them in the question and answer feature. But here's the last one for now. Proof of payment will only be required for those paid by employees' credit cards, ? I'm not sure I understand that question.
This is Joyce, so I'll jump in, and Mary, come back with another question if we don't catch this for you. So are you talking, if we're talking about making sure that there is proof that the resource provider paid the deployed personnel, that would be some kind of within the internal system. But if we're back to like an employee's meals or something like that, any expenses that you incurred, whether they were, okay, so you're talking proof of payment. So I think it's what I just said. You would have to show proof of payment for the resource provider to the deployed personnel, but any expenses, whether they're paid by cash or a credit card, can be reimbursed as long as you have that receipt documenting how that expense was paid. Hopefully that helps.
And that's, oh, wait, there's one more now. On the first slide of this section, it said something about comp time and reimbursement. Can you go over that again?
Might have to go back and look at that slide. Find it. So that would be dependent on that jurisdictional policies, whether or not you earn, whether or not you get comp time or don't get comp time would be part of that jurisdictional policy. Also, whether or not you get paid overtime or not is part of that jurisdictional policy.
And if I could just add to that with a practical example, when our staff in Iowa were activated for a disaster, we did not allow them to accrue comp time per our policy, because while I have perhaps federal money to pay those employees when they're doing disaster response, if we have a federal declaration, and I'm not talking EMAC here, that money might not be available later to pay out that comp time when I have to pay it out. So that is back to your policy on whether you can handle the reimbursement of the comp time accrued during a disaster response versus just day-to-day workload comp time.
Thanks, Joyce. Thanks, Angela. That's all the questions we have for right now.
That's good. So some key takeaways for today's presentation. EMAC works. It has a proven track record to efficiently and effectively provide resources to states during times of disaster and emergency. Consistency is the key to speed. Reimbursement packages need to be complete and submitted in a timely manner. They should also be returned to the assisting state if they are absolute rubbish. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Follow the guidelines, use the forms provided, and make reimbursement work. All states want to be able to depend on one another and less dependent on federal resources. So let's make it work. And Karen, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Angela. And Beth and Joyce for being with us today and sharing your expertise. Thank you also to our great audience for participating. You can find out more about the NEMA Empowerment e-learning series and how to sponsor one of your own in the resources section of the NEMA website, www.nemaweb.org. As a reminder, there'll be a short survey coming to you via email, and we would appreciate your feedback. Look for the recording of this session on the NEMA YouTube channel, NEMA for You, very soon. Thank you again for attending. Stay well. We hope to see you again soon. Have a productive rest of your day.
All right. Thank you, Karen. Thanks, Joyce. Thanks, Beth.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.